In the face of starvation and death, even the strongest moral boundaries collapse. These are the stories where survival meant crossing the unthinkable line. In the spring of 1846, nearly 90 men, women, and children, families, friends, and hired hands, gathered their hopes and belongings in Illinois. They dreamed of California's promise, fertile land, gold, and a new beginning. The journey west was grueling. Wagons creaked over muddy trails, oxen strained, and children played beside the endless line of travelers. Spirits were high, but the unknown loomed ahead. Known as the Donner Party, they followed the Oregon Trail until a fateful decision changed everything. A new route, the Hastings Cutoff, promised to save weeks, but few had ever traveled it. Led by Lansford Hastings's bold claims, the party split from the main trail near Fort Bridger. The shortcut led them into the Great Salt Lake Desert, an endless expanse of salt and mirages. The shortcut proved disastrous. Wagons broke, oxen collapsed, and precious water was lost. Tensions rose as days stretched into weeks. Arguments flared between families and leaders. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada, it was late October. Early, heavy snow began to fall, trapping the party at Truckee Lake, now Donner Lake, before they could cross the mountains. The snow piled higher each day, sealing off every escape. The families built makeshift cabins from logs and canvas, huddling together for warmth as the blizzards raged outside. Food supplies dwindled quickly. They boiled strips of leather, chewed on tree bark, and rationed the last crumbs of bread. Hunger gnawed at their bodies and minds. As weeks passed, the party faced unimaginable hardship. Children cried from hunger. Parents tried to comfort them, hiding their own fear and despair. Some attempted to hunt, but game was scarce. Others tried to trek out for help, only to be forced back by the relentless snow and exhaustion. The group's leaders, George Donner and James Reed, struggled to keep hope alive. Disagreements over leadership and survival plans divided the camp. As starvation set in, desperation grew. Some members died from malnutrition and exposure. The survivors faced a terrible choice: whether to eat the flesh of the dead to stay alive. Survivor Mary Graves later recalled, "We had become wild, desperate, and ravenous." The taboo was broken, and the line between civilization and survival vanished. Some survivors later described carving thin strips from frozen bodies, roasting them over small fires, or eating organs raw. Guilt and grief haunted every bite. In December, a group known as the Forlorn Hope, 5 women and 10 men, set out on homemade snowshoes to cross the mountains and seek rescue. Only 7 survived the journey. Their ordeal was harrowing, lost, starving, and forced to cannibalize the dead. But they reached a settlement and raised the alarm. Over the next months, 4 rescue parties braved the mountains. Each time, they found scenes of horror: gaunt survivors, hollow-eyed children, and cabins surrounded by corpses. Of the original 87, only 48 survived. The rest perished from starvation, exposure, or violence. The survivors carried scars, physical and emotional, that would never fully heal. News of the tragedy shocked the nation. Newspapers printed lurid headlines, and the name Donner became synonymous with horror and desperation. Survivors faced suspicion and stigma for the rest of their lives. Some refused to speak of what happened. Others tried to justify their actions as the only way to survive. The Donner Party's ordeal became a cautionary tale. It exposed the dangers of hubris, poor planning, and the harsh realities of westward expansion. Today, the pass where they were trapped bears their name, a stark reminder of how thin the line is between civilization and savagery when survival is at stake. On October 12, 1972, a chartered Fairchild FH-227D plane lifted off from Montevideo, Uruguay, carrying 45 people, members of the Old Christians rugby team, their friends, and family. The mood was light, filled with laughter and anticipation for the match ahead in Chile. The team was close-knit, a brotherhood forged on the rugby field. Many were students, some just teenagers, all excited for the adventure ahead. The Andes Mountains loomed in the distance, a breathtaking but dangerous barrier between them and their destination. As the plane approached the Andes, the weather turned treacherous. Clouds thickened, visibility dropped, and the pilots struggled to navigate the narrow mountain passes. Suddenly, a miscalculation in altitude brought disaster. The plane clipped a ridge, tearing off the wings and tail. The fuselage slammed into the snow at over 200 miles per hour, skidding to a halt on a remote glacier 12,000 feet above sea level. In an instant, the world was reduced to white silence and wreckage. Of the 45 on board, 33 survived the initial impact. They found themselves stranded on a frozen glacier, surrounded by jagged peaks and endless snow. Their supplies were meager: chocolate bars, a few bottles of wine, and whatever they could salvage from the wreckage. The survivors quickly organized themselves, tending to the wounded and using seat cushions for warmth. They melted snow for water and rationed every crumb. The cold was relentless, dropping to minus 30 degrees Celsius at night. Days passed. The group listened to a small transistor radio, clinging to hope as they heard news of search planes scouring the Andes. Each time a plane flew overhead, they waved desperately, but the white fuselage blended into the snow, invisible from above. After 8 days, the radio brought devastating news. The search had been called off. The world believed they were dead. The survivors were truly alone, with no hope of rescue. Hunger gnawed at their bodies. They tried to eat whatever they could find. Leather from suitcases, toothpaste, even strips of insulation, but nothing could stave off the starvation. As the days dragged on, the group faced an unthinkable decision. With no animals, no vegetation, and no rescue in sight, they discussed eating the bodies of those who had died in the crash. Some resisted, horrified by the idea. Others argued that it was the only way to survive. The group prayed together, seeking forgiveness for what they were about to do. In the end, hunger overcame horror. They cut strips of frozen flesh from their friends and teammates, often swallowing pieces raw because firewood was impossible to find. The act was not taken lightly. Survivors later described the guilt and grief that haunted every bite. They made a pact. If any of them died, their bodies would help the others live. As the weeks passed, the survivors endured unimaginable hardship. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Some lost hope and slipped into despair. Others clung to faith, reading from the Bible and comforting each other through the endless nights. The group dynamics shifted. Some became leaders, organizing daily routines and keeping spirits up. Others withdrew, haunted by memories of home and the friends they had lost. Then, disaster struck again. On the 17th day, an avalanche buried the fuselage, killing 8 more people and injuring others. The survivors dug frantically with bare hands, clawing through snow to reach the living and the dead. The avalanche left them even more isolated, with less shelter and fewer survivors. Yet in the face of tragedy, they found new resolve. They shared stories, sang songs, and tried to keep hope alive. As food ran out again, 3 men, Nando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vizintin, volunteered to trek out for help. They fashioned makeshift snowshoes and set off into the unknown, carrying only a sleeping bag sewn from insulation. The trek was brutal. They climbed icy slopes, crossed crevasses, and battled exhaustion and altitude sickness. After days of walking, Vizintin returned to the fuselage, leaving Parado and Canessa to continue alone. After 10 days, Parado and Canessa stumbled into a valley where they encountered a Chilean shepherd. The shepherd rode for help, and soon, news of the survivors reached the outside world. Helicopters arrived, braving the thin air and treacherous weather to reach the crash site. After 72 days in the Andes, 16 survivors were finally rescued. The world was stunned by their ordeal. Headlines around the globe told of the miracle in the Andes and the terrible price of survival. Some praised the survivors' courage and determination. Others condemned them for cannibalism, unable to comprehend the choices made in the mountains. The survivors themselves spoke openly about their decision. They explained that it was not desecration but a final act of love and sacrifice, a way for their friends to help them live. The psychological scars ran deep. Many survivors struggled with guilt, nightmares, and the burden of public scrutiny. Yet they also found strength in each other, forming lifelong bonds forged in the crucible of survival. Their story inspired books, documentaries, and the film Alive, bringing their ordeal to a global audience. More than 50 years later, the Andes flight disaster remains a haunting lesson in the limits of human endurance and the will to survive. Today, the crash site is a place of pilgrimage, Survivors and families returned to honor the lost, leaving crosses and mementos in the snow. The story of Flight 571 endures, a testament to the power of hope, the bonds of friendship, and the darkness that can emerge when all other options are gone. In the early 19th century, Van Diemen's Land, now known as Tasmania, was a place of exile and punishment. The British Empire sent its most hardened criminals to this remote island, hoping the wild landscape would break their spirits. Among the thousands transported was Alexander Pearce, a poor Irish farm laborer convicted of theft. Like many, he was sentenced to years of hard labor for a minor crime, torn from his homeland and family. Pearce arrived at Macquarie Harbour Penal Station, a prison infamous for its brutality. Surrounded by impenetrable rainforest and icy waters, escape seemed impossible. The guards were cruel, the rations meager, and the punishments severe. Life in the penal colony was a daily struggle for survival. Men toiled in the mud, building roads and cutting timber under the lash. Disease and despair were constant companions. Yet, even in this hellish place, hope flickered. Pearce and 7 other convicts began to plot their escape, each driven by desperation and the dream of freedom. On a cold night in September 1822, they slipped into the forest, carrying only a stolen axe, a cooking pot, and the clothes on their backs. The wilderness closed around them, silent and unforgiving. The escapees were a motley crew, some violent, some cunning, all hardened by years of suffering. They argued over direction and leadership, but all knew the dangers that lay ahead: raging rivers, steep mountains, and endless forest. The Tasmanian wilderness was unlike anything they had known. Rain fell for days, soaking their clothes and chilling them to the bone. Leeches clung to their skin. Every step was a battle against mud, thorns, and exhaustion. With no map and no provisions, they quickly ran out of food. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. They tried to eat berries, roots, and whatever small animals they could catch, but the land offered little mercy. Days passed. The men grew weaker, their faces gaunt, their tempers fraying. The forest seemed endless, the rivers impassable. Rain and cold sapped their strength. One by one, hope faded. The men began to turn on each other, suspicion and fear taking hold. Pearce later confessed that, as starvation set in, the group killed and ate the weakest among them. Pearce claimed he was reluctant at first, but hunger overcame morality. The line between man and beast blurred as survival instincts took over. The journey became a nightmare. Each day, fewer men remained. Pearce trudged on, haunted by guilt and the memory of his companions. The forest, once a place of hope, became a prison of shadows and bones. Weeks later, Pearce was found by a search party, starving, filthy, and alone. He was the only one left alive. Returned to prison, Pearce confessed his crimes. The authorities were horrified, refusing to believe his story. They called him a liar, a monster, a man driven mad by the wilderness. But less than a year later, Pearce escaped again. This time, he was caught with human flesh in his pockets. There was no denying the truth. Alexander Pearce had survived by consuming his fellow escapees. News of Pearce's ordeal spread quickly. In Australia and Britain, newspapers printed lurid headlines. Some saw him as a monster, proof that the wilderness could corrupt men beyond redemption. Others saw a victim of a brutal system, driven to the edge by desperation. In 1824, Pearce was hanged for his crimes. His story became legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the penal colonies and retold in the streets of London. Today, historians debate Pearce's legacy. Was he a monster, or a man pushed beyond the limits of endurance? His story is not just about cannibalism, but about the darkness that emerges when hope is gone and survival is all that remains. In 1845, Sir John Franklin, a seasoned Arctic explorer, prepared to lead one of the most ambitious expeditions of the Victorian era. 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, were fitted with the latest technology: steam engines, reinforced hulls, and enough supplies to last 3 years. The goal? To chart the fabled Northwest Passage and secure Britain's dominance in Arctic exploration. The crew of 129 men was handpicked for skill and discipline. Officers like Francis Crozier, an Irishman with years of polar experience, and James Fitzjames, a charismatic young commander, joined Franklin on the journey. Spirits were high as the ships set sail from England, cheered by crowds and celebrated in the press. With 129 men, well-supplied ships, and high hopes, the expedition set out from England to great fanfare. Life aboard Erebus and Terror was a mix of routine and hardship. The men worked in shifts, maintaining engines, navigating ice, and keeping journals. Meals were taken in cramped messes with preserved meats and ship's biscuits. Officers dined separately, discussing navigation and morale. To pass the endless polar night, the crew staged plays, read aloud, and clung to letters from home. As the ships pressed deeper into the ice, the temperature plummeted. Endless daylight gave way to months of darkness. The men faced frostbite, scurvy, and the constant threat of the ice crushing their ships. Journals from the officers reveal growing anxiety as the pack ice closed in. For nearly 2 years, Erebus and Terror remained locked in the ice. The men tried to hunt for fresh meat, but game was scarce. Scurvy and tuberculosis spread. Some men began to show signs of lead poisoning, likely from poorly soldered food tins. The psychological toll was immense. Hope faded as the months dragged on. In April 1848, with Franklin dead and Crozier now in command, the survivors made a desperate decision. They abandoned the ships, hauling sledges loaded with boats and supplies across the ice, hoping to reach safety hundreds of miles to the south. The trek was brutal. Men collapsed from hunger and cold. Some turned back, others pressed on. Inuit hunters later described meeting small groups of starving white men, begging for food and shelter. None of the men ever made it to safety. Their bodies were found scattered along the route, some still clutching journals or relics from home. Inuit oral histories, passed down for generations, spoke of men cutting flesh from the dead to survive. For years, rumors of cannibalism haunted the British public. The Admiralty launched search after search, but found only graves and wreckage. Many in Britain refused to believe the stories, clinging to the myth of heroic explorers. In the 1980s, modern forensic scientists examined skeletal remains found on King William Island. They discovered cut marks on bones, evidence of defleshing and marrow extraction. The truth, long denied, was finally confirmed. Inuit testimony, once dismissed, was finally recognized as vital historical evidence. Their accounts described the final days of the expedition. Men staggering through the snow, desperate, some carrying human remains for food. The fate of Erebus and Terror remained a mystery for more than 150 years. In the 21st century, the wrecks were finally discovered, preserved in the icy depths. Artifacts recovered from the ships offered new insights into the daily lives and final struggles of the crew. Though wrecks of the Erebus and Terror were only discovered in the 21st century, offering new insights, the haunting truth remains that Britain's finest explorers had been reduced to eating each other in their last bid for survival. The story of the Franklin expedition shocked Victorian society. Some saw the men as tragic heroes, others as victims of imperial hubris. The families of the lost waited years for news, clinging to hope that never came. The Franklin expedition is remembered not only as a tale of failed discovery, but as a reminder of how even the strongest men collapse under the weight of hunger and cold, proving that the Arctic itself was the ultimate victor. From the snowy peaks of the Andes to the frozen silence of the Arctic, these stories reveal how far humans will go when death is closing in. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more tales where survival came at the ultimate cost. And remember, hunger is a predator that waits in the shadows, and it does not let go until something else is gone.